everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about some unconventional places to throw your crankbaits. A crankbait is one of those baits that is excellent at generating a lot of strikes from both fish that are inactive as well as from really big fish. In my opinion, it's one of the best baits at triggering above average size bass into biting. And it's often referred to as a bait that's just used to get down deep, bump off the bottom. Maybe you're fishing some ledges, maybe you're fishing deep points, that type of structure. But I'm here to tell you, you don't have to throw a crankbait in those conventional places. There's a lot of other areas that you probably can generate some good bites from fish if you're willing to throw it in those areas. So that's what we're going to talk about today is several places to throw a crankbait like this Berkeley dime that where other people probably are not throwing them. So the first place I'm going to just reference is one of my favorite places to throw a crankbait that oftentimes never ever see a crankbait, and that's on some of your shallow matted grass lines. So whether you're going down a line of floating hydrilla, maybe you're going down a line of floating hyacinth mats, maybe it's just a solid line, hard line of like floated, torn up grass. So a lot of places down in like Florida will have mats that are formed from just grass that's been ripped up from boat propellers or all different things. But I love to go down those hard lines and fish a crankbait. Now, in that situation, generally speaking, you're probably in 4 feet of water or less, so I'll throw a shallower running crankbait. But I'm literally paralleling down that line, throwing a crankbait in places most other people would never throw a crankbait. It's really surprising to me how infrequently you'll see somebody throwing a crankbait in that situation. But it is a great bait to draw fish out from underneath those mats where they will commit to your bait. So I love fishing it under that situation. A similar area where a lot of people aren't willing to put up with it is your deep weed lines. Most people would not throw a crankbait around thicker grass, and that's what you have on your deep weed lines. A lot of time, a deep weed line is specifically where the weeds just end because the water depth gets too deep for the grass to grow. So you get a hard edge where you go from grass to no grass. Up here in my neck of the woods, a lot of times that's going to be anywhere from 8 to 20 feet of water. And a crankbait thrown parallel along those grass edges can be phenomenally productive. It's just up to the angler to recognize that there are going to be a lot of casts where you're ripping the crankbait out of the grass, which can be physically demanding. It can lead to some frustration, but there's very few baits, in my opinion, that work as well at generating bites, especially bigger quality bites on those grass edges than a deep crank. So that's one other place I like to throw it. A third place is on schooling fish. You very infrequently hear about people throwing crankbaits at schooling fish, but I love to throw cranks, both shallow running and deep running cranks out in the middle of the lake where you've got fish that are chasing bait balls. And I'll throw both. You know, generally speaking, a lot of times what you have is bass pushing bait to the surface, which is why you see the schooling activity. So a shallow crank can be really good when you see the actual bass busting on the surface, because at that point the fish are up shallow or up against the surface. But in those same areas where I see a lot of bait busting, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll throw a deeper crank and I'll just retrieve it through the middle of the water column, because what happens when those fish aren't actively busting the shad is they've actually dropped down deeper to get ready to push the shad back up to the surface. So when I'm not actively seeing schooling activity, I'll actually pick up a deep crank and fish it in those same areas where I have seen schooling activity. And a lot of times that can generate action from fish that are now back down deeper, waiting to push bait up again to the surface. Another place that I love to throw cranks, both shallow and deep again, is around bridge pilings. I can't tell you the number of big fish that I've caught retrieving a deep crank where it deflects off of bridge piling that might be in 60 or 70 feet of water, but the fish are holding only down 10, 15, 20 feet. You know, in the summer months, a lot of times you'll still have thermoclines that set up, even though you've got, you know, that narrowing portion of the lake where the bridges generally are. Those thermoclines still will position the fish up a little bit higher in the water column relative to how deep it can be around those areas. So a deep crank retrieved against the bridge pilings can be absolutely dynamite at triggering those fish to bite. At the same time, sometimes those fish are sitting higher up in the water column, and you're only going to be using a crankbait that runs 4 to 6 feet down. So I'll fish both. You know, a lot of times if I'm on a good bridge bite, I'll actually fish the shallow one first to see if there's fish that are up closer to the surface, because I feel like if I retrieve a deep crank, I'm going to come under them and potentially spook those fish. But I feel like if I can cast to those fish first with the shallow crank, that'll generate the bites from fish that are usually more active. The higher up in the water column they are generally more active fish. So I'll try to catch them first. After I'm done with the shallow crank, I'll pick up a deeper crank and I'll retrieve it to deflect off those bridge pilings. Now, one tip with the bridge pilings is your boat positioning can be really key in terms of making the correct cast. And a lot of times you don't know what that is, but you have to figure out what cast is working. So when you do get bit on a cast, make that same cast multiple times, because it was the way that that bait came across that bridge piling that generated the bite. And you got to remember, a lot of times your bridges are set up where you do have a little bit of moving water because it's a bottleneck on the lake. And from that standpoint, a lot of times the fish will group up and sit in the exact same place because that's where you have a little bit of an eddy or a current break. And when you, excuse me, when you make that same cast, that's when you can trigger them um, into biting on multiple casts. So keep that in mind anytime you're fishing bridge pilings. But definitely think about throwing a crankbait on those bridge pilings. It creates a great deflection bite. Uh, Another place where I love to fish a deep crank specifically, and this kind of goes against the norm as well, is on your shallow shell bars and shallow gravel bars. Generally speaking, I'm talking about areas where they might be, I'm going to say 4 to 10, 12 foot of water. I like to throw a crankbait that's a deep running crankbait, much deeper than how deep those shell bars are. It really grind the bottom. I like to go through that shell and deflect and shoot some of that shell all over the place, just stir up a commotion. And I feel like that does a couple of things. One, it draws the interest from other fish that are in the area because something's going through that area, stirring everything up like a potentially like a crayfish could or a bigger fish that's in there feeding. But a lot of times what happens when you have a bigger fish that's in there feeding, like a carp or a catfish that's stirring up the bottom, your drum will do this. It creates kind of like a dust cloud. You get a lot of bait fish that move into those areas that feed behind those bigger fish, because those bigger fish are stirring up sediment in the water that's drawing kind of that beginning of the food chain. And anytime you get some bait fish that are in there moving around that are feeding, you're going to have bigger game fish like your bass that are in there trying to take advantage of feeding bait fish that aren't necessarily paying attention to the bigger game fish that are trying to eat them. And your bigger crankbaits that come through those areas will stir those areas up and generate a lot of strikes. So definitely get yourself some big crankbaits and throw them in areas where other people wouldn't normally. Like I said, a lot of your hard lines, whether that's matted vegetation or floating vegetation that's matted up, or your deep grass lines, your shallow shell bars, bridge pilings, and throw them out in the middle of nowhere where fish are schooling up. Those are all places where a lot of people would not throw a crankbait, but they can be absolutely phenomenal at generating a lot of bites. So give them a try. If you're not throwing them, I'm telling you, it's one of the best baits to catch a giant bass. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.